Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate on this show to have spoken to some of the world's best athletes, sports people, people who work in sports across a range of different capacities, trainers, coaches, psychologists. We also have a segment on the show. We speak to some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields to give us insight into their work. And today we have a special guest who's going to give us a really fascinating insight into the world of performance psychology. It's really fascinating, and I suppose psychology's really made a big impact in the last few years, and we kind of think that the experiences over the last year or so has been challenging, and I think it's really fascinating in terms of how different athletes have adapted to the world around us and the impact that obviously the world has experienced over the past year, and to sort of keep focused. So we have a really fascinating guest today who's going to sort of share some insight into the world of performance psychology, who's worked in professional sport, who's worked with some great athletes, who I'm sure will tell us a bit more about his work in the interview. Really fascinating insight into the work he does and into the professional performance psychology. So Tom Bates, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Absolute pleasure, Jimmy. Great to be with you.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on board, Tom. You're a performance psychologist and a coach and consultant. You've got a lot of experience. You've worked in football for a long time, and no doubt there's been a lot of experiences that you've had in your own career. But I suppose if we start from the beginning, what sort of got you into the field yourself? What was your sort of motivation to go into performance psychology?
Oh, it's a really good question. It's a question I get asked quite a lot. And to be honest, I think we have to go back even further than just as an adolescent, but as a young kid. I was played for Cambridge United Youth Development Centre, and that was where I grew up and was born and was raised in Cambridge, England. And probably was a player that did very well, but wasn't necessarily the best type of player when it came to technical, tactical, physical. Tried really hard and has achieved a certain level. But back then, as a kid, I really remember, times when I looked around and I realised that players with around me, probably with more talent, but less attitude, less positive attitude, weren't really maximising their talent. And through a really strong attitude myself, I tried to maximise my own talent, which was limited. But I also remember times when I was nervous as a player. I was even fearful of big competitions, or if there would be a lot of crowd in for a particular match, cup finals, penalty kicks, etc. And I became curious as a 12, 13, 14, whether it was possible to coach and improve ourselves and our thinking, in the way that we feel, in the way that we process and manage our emotions in performance. And so I actually didn't make it to senior level. I didn't become a professional. I wasn't good enough. But I think that looking back, I probably dealt with working with somebody like me, who was able to help players deal with the mental and emotional challenges, as well as the technical, tactical, physical. So after long story short, after I finished as a player, I still continued to love football and coaching, and went down to Bournemouth University and studied something called sports psychology and coaching sciences. So it's the combination of coaching, but specialising in psychology to understand thoughts, feelings, emotions, behaviours, in sport. And really from there, you could say it became a formal occupation, from university, but it was something that just was part of who I am and my journey, even from a young age.
Yeah, and that's really interesting stuff. And what I'm sort of curious about, and no doubt the listeners are, Tom, is when you sort of made your way in the game, and you've worked with some great clubs, Villa, Brentford, and West Brom, Birmingham, and you've worked for many great clubs with great tradition and pedigree. And in the world of football, what was it like when you sort of first entered the world of football in that sort of capacity, in terms of the mental side of the game? What was your experience like in the beginning, in terms of how was psychology and sort of mental skills received?
Not well. not well at all. If we go back 15 years, performance psychology, almost unheard of. And even though I had been a player at Cambridge United, I didn't have any real contacts in the game. And so I remember, I wrote, so there was I down in Bournemouth. I was studying sports psychology and coaching sciences, year 3 as placement year. And I wrote a letter I remember this very clearly, every single league club in the Premier League all the way down to League 2 and clubs in the USA and around, requesting a placement to go and practice what I thought that I was learning, and so one by one the letters came back. In fact, I remember a letter from Jose Mourinho at Chelsea at the time coming back to say, no, there's nothing of that nature available, but we thank you for your time and wish you every success. And pretty much every club said the same thing. So there wasn't sports psychology, performance psychology, working with a psychologist in sport. It wasn't really that heard of back then, and it's becoming much more popular now. But forging a career, if you like, in that field, I remember I had to work for free for much of that time at Bournemouth in the early days to really just allow others to understand what it was, what it looked like, how it worked, what the benefit was, how the coaches could benefit, not just the players but also the parents. And from there, the results were pretty remarkable. And even I was surprised at how, in the end, how popular it became and valuable to the clubs that have employed me since: Birmingham City and West Bromwich Albion, Brentford Football Club, Aston Villa, and so on and so forth. So it's been a true privilege for me to have that journey. But quick story, I don't know if you've got time for this, but I remember at Birmingham City Football Club, I'd had the interview. Alex McLeish had seen me, and a guy called Terry Wesley, who was the academy manager. I'd got the job, and I was so excited. It was my very first day. So I'd convinced 2 senior figures who were, respected and revered. I've got the job as performance psychologist. It's my very first day. I'm walking across the indoor dome when it's club photograph day. And so I'm literally bouncing. I've just moved to the Midlands. This is a great big new job. I'm so happy to be here. And a guy who's been at the club for grey hair, big moustache, comes across, and a thick Brummie accent comes across, and he meets me halfway across the dome. He says, you're the new psychologist that's come in, aren't you? And I offered my hand out, and big smile on my face. I said, yeah, great, fantastic to be here, thanks. And he just left my hand in midair. I can't repeat what he actually said, but he said, what a load of beep, and walked off.
Wow.
And so, I quickly became aware that not everybody was on board with the idea of performance psychology and the benefits that it brings. So
and absolutely. I mean, the thing is really interesting, Tom. I mean, obviously, I'd pretty place you as one of the sort of pioneers of sort of bringing psychology into the game. Obviously, like you said, it's over the last few years, it's sort of it's a given now. But certainly when you sort of you could sort of say you're one of the pioneers of bringing psychology on a level where obviously on a level where it became a big deal, really, in terms of people start to realise that and the results kind of, like you said, speak for themselves, really. I guess the thing with psychology, Tom, I don't know what your take is on it. It's probably harder to quantify it and say, if you've got like a fitness coach, you can show like the fitness results, technical, you can sort of show, okay. Psychology, is there a way for you to sort of quantify? Obviously, if the team's doing well, but when a team is doing well, there's plenty of people who will take credit for that. But how do you how does one quantify the work that a psychologist is doing with the players? I mean, what are some of the ways, other than obviously performances, but is there any other ways you can sort of measure, the impact you're having on the team?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because of course a psychologist really deals with the intangibles much of the time. How can you measure emotion? How can you measure a thought process? It's a lot easier to measure the power output from a deadlift or a chest press, or physiological processes that take place as part of performance. So in many ways, the thing about it is that when you speak to a player or a coach and you ask them, what was the difference in today's performance, or why do you feel the performance went so well? Largely, they will talk about the power of the attitude of the team, team spirit, how much the players believed in the team, in the game plan, how they took ownership, how they didn't crumble under the pressure in the last minutes. And of course, what we find is coaches and players attribute success or failure a lot more to the mental and emotional processes as opposed to the physiological processes that get measured.
Yes.
And so we know that it's hugely valuable, right? And we know that it's defining. In fact, we could say that when the technical, tactical, physical preparation is done, what defines performance? Well, mindset defines performance.
Yeah.
When players are required to be at their best. So then, is it possible to coach and train the way that we think to improve the way we feel and thus get better performance output? Of course, the rational answer is yes. But in terms of answering the question, the idea of measuring is a pretty difficult one. In the research and literature, it's called qualitative research and not quantitative. I mean, there are lots of different psychometrics that get administered that measure the mental emotional traits, subjective reportings and observations and conversations, of course, that attribution, so players and coaches talking about how they believe, how important it was and how it influenced them, the differences that it made to them and their performances. In fact, very often, I think one of my players, actually, his name's Tyler Roberts, he's on international duty at the minute with Wales, but he did an interview the other day, and it was nice of him to mention me. He didn't have to, but he did. And one of the things that we talk about is how well prepared he is mentally and emotionally, using the strategies and techniques that he employs and uses for himself to improve his performance. So I think the best way, probably the ultimate way to measure, is when a player or a coach says, "This really made a difference for me. This was important for us, and we really believe in this." Absolutely. I think that could well be the perhaps the most powerful way to measure the influence.
Absolutely. It's really interesting, Tom. I mean, a few years ago I went to a conference, and I heard about sort of the work that Brentford were doing, and in terms of recruiting players. I don't know a great deal about only what I heard and what they were doing, really. And what I found really interesting, I sort of found myself thinking, okay, I only speak based on what I knew, how players were being, the recruitment and the sort of the film Moneyball type thing. It got thrown around a little bit, but I kind of wondered the psychological side. I kind of thought, well, I wonder these players psychologically, in terms of if that's, where they are psychologically. You get a player, they come on board, and you get them to play, like you mentioned, to the best of their ability, not just physically but mentally. Are you okay to give us an insight in terms of some of the work you did at Brentford, Tom? Obviously it's confidential to a point, but is there any insights you can give us to the work you did at Brentford and sort of, I mean, obviously punch above their weight?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course I can. And you're dead right. They very much do punch above their weight. And the reason they do punch above their weight is because they have a fantastic owner, Mr. Matthew Benham. I was extremely privileged to be recruited by Matthew and also Rasmus Ankersen and Phil Giles, who are the football directors, technical directors of Brentford. And they were courageous enough to think differently. The whole model of Brentford has been widely publicised in recent times, is that they can't outspend, so they have to outthink. And that entire culture of being curious enough to think differently, and also being courageous enough to think differently, was very much the reason why the position of performance psychologist was adopted at Brentford. And I have to say I was extremely privileged and blessed to be able to go in and work with those guys. So really, but it wasn't just my role. I have to say there were other roles that also become more popular. So we had a throw-in coach at Brentford.
Wow.
Again, something that's become more popular now, but unheard of. I know that Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool has also employed a throw-in coach. We had a set-piece coach to study specifically the set pieces, and strategies to convey that to the players and the head coach. We had a kicking specialist who would come in and work specifically on the biomechanics and execution of the movements of the kick. We had a head of football philosophy, so to underpin and work with the head coach on articulating the style of play and running that through the first team all the way through into the academies and the younger players. So it was a really hard-working, humble and hungry culture that was created at Brentford, and I was very privileged just to be a small part of that.
No, it's really interesting. You say that's really fascinating. No doubt the listeners and any coaches listening to that sort of attention to detail. I mean, we sort of watch sport and watch football and see teams perform, and it's really interesting to get an insight into the hard work and dedication and the attention to detail to achieve. And I suppose one thing that's sort of apparent speaking to you, Tom, is the fine line, the margins of success that can be so minimal, like just that throw in or just getting the best out of players, running, movement, and there's so many small things that just accumulate and add up. I mean, for our listeners, just wondering what it's like to be, your role. What's it like to work in? I know obviously different clubs will be different, but what's it generally like, sort of, to work in your role in football, Tom? For anyone sort of thinking that's a road they want to take, or what's the sort of general day like for working in that environment?
Yeah, goodness me. I mean, it's a great question. One of the things that we probably should point out is that within psychology and the provision of psychology, there are lots of different types of practitioners. So some are clinical, some are educational based, some are sport based. There is psychiatry, which is separate to psychology, and so there under that whole banner of mental performance, there are lots of different practitioners that practice in a different way. I guess the thing that makes me a little bit unique is that I was an A licensed coach, so I came from the coaching world, and I understood that there was, as I evolved in my coaching career, I understood that there was something beyond the X's and the O's, something else, something somehow governing performance, and of course that is, as we've been speaking about, mindset. So a typical day for me. It's not an easy question to answer that one, because it's so diverse and so different. Whilst I was working at Aston Villa Football Club, I would be in the board room with the directors and chief executive and owner sometimes, speaking about the vision and philosophy and how to get the very best from our staff, how to create the right environment for our people as human beings to be able to function optimally in their working life and with the team, to support the team behind the team, to help them with their vision of the future, to support them execute and live out the values, beliefs and expectations that they hold to be defining of the culture. All of these were very much part of the day job. But then, of course, there's the performance side, to work with the players directly, with the first team senior players at the time, to improve performance, work with the coaches, the head coach, the manager, and the support staff, to be able to be of assistance in the constant everyday battle between building confidence and dealing with the setbacks. Sometimes I'd be in team coaches in corridors, in dressing rooms. Sometimes it's an office. Sometimes it's the hotel lobby. Sometimes it's in the stadium. I remember very vividly walking out onto the pitch at Wembley in our playoff final against Fulham, and the pitch, the empty stadium became the very place that was my office. I mean, my office can be literally anywhere, and so that means that I have to be very diverse and very able to be flexible and adapt to the needs of the people. And that's really the key thing, I would say, out of all of this role, is to be able to possess a skill set to see the world through the eyes of the person that you're working with, to see the world through their eyes.
Yes, and that's really interesting stuff, powerful stuff, Tom. I suppose one thing I'm thinking about, you having mentioned that, is in terms of yourself. I mean, I can imagine that in a high pressured environment, in a high pressured environment where results are key. It's results driven. Obviously, the bottom line is on the weekend, the performance is in sport is what coaches and athletes are judged on ultimately. In terms of yourself, I mean, how do you sort of are you okay to share? Let's go to the question: who motivates the motivator, Tom? How do you sort of do you have strategies for yourself to be able to sort of like recharge the batteries and sort of stay sort of focused and I suppose the energy required to do the role? I mean, do you have sort of techniques for yourself that you do to recharge and refocus?
Oh, absolutely. I have many mentors. Absolutely, 100%. Great phrase, motivate the motivator.
Yeah.
I have supervisors as well at a professional level, psychologists that are specifically designed to work with the psychologist, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Because, I'm a human being, so I'm not impervious to the stresses and emotions that come with living in the world. I'm professionally trained and qualified to help others. But sometimes even I need help to be able to manage myself, and that's why I have a trusted group of supervisors. I have a mentor, a personal mentor, which sits outside of all of the clubs. His name is Bill Beswick. He's been a mentor of mine for many, many years and helped and coached me along the way. I also have a very strong family, and my wife, Hannah, is a consistent backbone. She should be doing this interview because she has to take a lot of credit for the success.
Yeah.
She's a wonderful mother and my wife, and I love her dearly for the strength that she shows daily. And she is, in many ways, my biggest and strongest mentor. And of course, I have to mention that I also have a faith in God, and that is very strong and is a major part of who I am and how I live my life.
That's really interesting stuff. I think what I find interesting there, Tom, you mentioned obviously within psychology the different sort of components, and I suppose in the performance role there is that fine line between a player is the footballer maybe lacking motivation or confidence, or could it be a clinical issue? Do you sort of find in those roles that it's useful to have a network and say, well, actually, this performer might need clinical help? Is that you sort of find situations like where players it might not necessarily just be performance, it might just be that they've had an adverse event and they're struggling, and maybe they do have like a condition,
Yes, absolutely. There have been multiple times in each organisation that I've worked in where we're with the sports science and medicine team, the club doctors. We have had to develop a clinical referral network, a team of psychiatrists and therapists that have the capacity to respond to clinically diagnosed mental illnesses and conditions. And that is fundamental because I am, and this is back to how we started really, about the differences in the industry, because I'm not qualified or experienced really to deal with those clinical issues. It's very much about performance psychology, and oftentimes the clinical network is and has been, and I think probably more now than ever before, is becoming an increasingly important network for clubs in the modern day.
Absolutely, yeah, getting the right help that the performer might need. That's for sure. That's really interesting stuff. And I suppose in saying that, the other side to it, Tom, that I've found over the years, and I think that we've obviously psychology having a bigger impact in the game. It's also, there's been positives, I suppose, but the other side to it too, I think that it's also increased the level of sort of people looking to get involved in the game. We've obviously various credentials. It's not for me to say what people do and that sort of stuff. But I suppose in saying that there is the other side to it, sort of knowing the person's remit in the game in terms of what they do and how they sort of help the players, and you got like your motivational speakers, you've got various skills coaches as well, and I mean Have you sort of seen that sort of explosion of different people getting involved in the game, looking to get involved in the game to sort of offer different sort of capacities around the mental skills?
I think you mean the popularity and awareness of the mental side of the game has increased?
It has, and I think, but with that, Tom, it's also brought people in the game who, I suppose, in saying that sort of the regulation around what one does in psychology, so that being sort of clear, and I suppose in saying that yourself, who's sort of qualified and got a lot of experience, you understand a referral network. But the other side to it that sometimes I get a bit concerned about is the person is not quite sure, and the player might need a referral. Let's say a player's released and it's an adverse event for them, and they sort of fall into depression. And you've got someone sort of trying to motivate them, where really maybe they should say, well, maybe you need to see a GP or clinician going forward. So there is that fine line, do you think, possibly, with the mental skills making more of an impact as well?
Absolutely, and that is why the clinical referral network that I speak about through the GPs and the clubs and club doctors, this isn't that side of it should be as important, and this is where the medical teams at the club have worked at were very good. The players are screened psychometrically, clinically, when they have their medical, when they come in. And so, if for example a player is being screened for any damage to, musculoskeletal, for example, any previous scar tissue or anything like that, then why would we not consider it important to also help them with a screening process, through a clinical, with a clinical check, with interview, response, and psychometrics. So that's the first thing. It must be integrated, as opposed to something that you do just to fix a problem. It has to be embedded within the way that we work, and followed up regularly, as much as so would be any physiological massage or treatment, or anything for the body. The mind really is the athlete. The body is simply the means. So the understanding of the clinical nature, or at least understanding the boundaries, your own restrictions. Because oftentimes what happens is coaches don't know that they don't know. And it's not their fault that they don't know, but they just see a psychologist in a club as the one to fix everything.
Yes,
you're the one that can fix all of these mental conditions, and because of course there is a spectrum, and there are very separate clinical issues that we've just talked about. I would say 100% there needs to be very explicit, clearly referenced boundaries to anybody working within a professional environment, not just for their own sakes, but for the sakes of everybody that they work with as well. And I think we've still got a bit of a way to go, if I'm honest, about making that very clear for everyone. And I guess like in all industries, it has to be very well regulated, and there are clear qualifications that people need to take. And I'm a huge advocate of, if anyone is thinking of becoming or getting involved at a very professional level, then pursuing the right and proper qualifications, experience, and regulations set out by the governing bodies that are responsible for psychology and sport. Absolutely,
that's a great point you've made there, and I think that's sort of really, really important. I think sort of in years gone by, I suppose, when sort of players would sort of maybe speak to physios about things that are going on, or maybe different coaches, and sort of everyone being sort of clear on a clear process is always a good thing to get the player the right support that they need. In terms of yourself, Tom, I mean, obviously you've worked at the highest level of the game. You've achieved a lot in the game, and I know that you've got a lot more you want to achieve. And what's your sort of vision, if you don't mind me asking, going forward? Are you okay to sort of share? Is it more of the same in terms of yourself? Just keep going, and where do you sort of see yourself from where you are now? You've sort of been at the highest level, and do you have any plans going forward? No doubt you do. Or where do you sort of see yourself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I left Aston Villa in 2018, and I'm currently operating as an independent consultant now for my own company, Tom Bates Coaching Limited.
Yeah.
And that allows me to, when I worked in a club, it was great, and there were many great things about working within a club. But it also did, I guess, it becomes restricting in as much as that you can't do other things, and you can't help other people that come in and request certain things from other clubs and other athletes that were in different leagues. And so what I love doing right now is working with a lot of different teams, a lot of different athletes and players from all over the place, all around the world. And because I'm not restricted by one contract, it allows me to help as many people as possible. And so I think the great privilege, I'm extremely privileged that I'm working with athletes at the minute that will be competing in the Olympic Games, the English Premier League. So that's at the, as you say, Jimmy, the very highest level of sport. But then I'm also involved in supporting and working with children and coaches of children and educators and people, head teachers, and leadership groups in educational institutions. And so it's a wonderful, diverse range of support that I am able to offer now. And the enrichment of that diversity, I think, is making me a better person, a better practitioner, and that much better for those that I can support. But for sure, my real passion is high performance sport. That's where I come from, and that's what I do most day to day. And I think the future is a role in helping organisations to place performance psychology and the service of performance psychology at the very centre, embedded within the culture and the organisation. And probably when I think about it, Jimmy, Brentford has been, and West Brom, Brentford and West Bromwich Albion have been the closest to really achieving that.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. I mean, in terms of, you mentioned that the education side of things, I think it's a great thing that people like yourself, Tom, are getting involved in education and schools, and I think that anything that that can sort of complement what the teachers do, and that sort of mindset is a really, really great thing, really, for sure. And that's really interesting stuff. I mean, no doubt our listeners have sort of been sort of curious and found this really fascinating to listen to. In terms of your book, Tom, can you tell us a bit about the book and where maybe the listeners can get the book if they want to sort of read more and learn more about some of the processes you've talked about?
Sure. My book, The Future Coach, Coaching Tomorrow's Soccer Players Today, 9 Principles taken from Sports Psychology, is available on Amazon. You can also read more about the book on my website, tombatescoaching.com.
Brilliant. No, and in terms of getting in touch, if anyone's interested to sort of know more, is that the website they go to, Tom, or is there any sort of specific website they can maybe log on and get in touch with yourself if they sort of are interested in maybe sort of collaborating or working or anything like that?
Absolutely. You can find me on all the socials, Instagram, Tom Bates Coaching, Twitter and Facebook. We also have a YouTube platform where lots of different recorded interviews with professional athletes and lectures and talks that I've given is available. And the main website is tombatescoaching.com. And if you are interested, then tom@tombatescoaching.com is my email address. But there's lots of different material out there for guys to go and check out.
Brilliant, fantastic. I really want to thank you, Tom, for coming aboard the show. It's been great interviewing you. I found it really interesting, and no doubt the listeners have sort of, really found interesting too. It's been fascinating, and no doubt there's a lot more to we probably could have spoke for as long as but we've covered a lot, and I've been really grateful to join us on the show. It's great stuff. Thanks very much, Tom. I really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure, Jimmy. Thank you. Yeah. Take care.
And that was Tom Bates, performance psychologist, to give us a really interesting insight into his work, what he's done in professional sports and football over the years, and what he's doing now. And really fascinating interview. Check out his work. It's fantastic. Even if you're not involved in sport, just generally speaking, some reading just for mindset. And as I said, these skills are transferable to many areas. Definitely worth a read. That was Tom Bates. Joining us on the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.5 FM, your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.